Welcome to this training video, which supports the delivery of the Year 10 Risks and Relationships unit as part of the OAT Citizenship and PSHE Education curriculum. This unit consists of a total of 9 lessons, which builds on the RSC unit from Year 9, including specific content on sexual harassment, commitment, contraception, fertility, pregnancy options, and parenting. Before teaching this unit, it's important to ensure that all parents and carers are aware of the planned content and that they're reminded of their legal right to request withdrawal from content which your school has deemed as sex education content within its RSC or PSHE policy. As a reminder, parents and carers may not request withdrawal from content around relationships or around health. The first lesson begins with a Do Now activity, which asks pupils to write examples of compliments that people may give to others. It may be helpful to remind pupils about distancing the learning here and that they're not being asked to share compliments that they themselves have given. Pupils can anonymously write these on post-it notes and stick them to a whiteboard or a designated wall, at which point you can then summarise some of those comments. Keep the post-it notes up on the wall, as they'll be revisited at the end of the lesson once pupils have learnt more about sexual harassment. Pupils are then asked to complete this worksheet, in which they should plot a variety of actions along the continuum, showing the extent to which they think the behaviours are acceptable. Given that the examples are already listed on the worksheet, pupils can simply label each of the plots with the relevant letter, as shown in the example here. It would also be really good to encourage pupils to annotate 2 or 3 of their plots with a comment to show their thinking. That then means that they're ready to have their arguments formulated prior to the class discussion. The continuum template is included in the slide deck so you can compare pupils' placement and justifications. After reading the definition of sexual harassment, you can come back to this work and ask pupils to consider the point at which they think the behaviours could be considered as sexual harassment. They could add a dotted line or a bracket, as in the example here, to show their ideas and then discuss these views further. Further into the lesson, pupils listen to a scenario about a person named Val, who is 18 and is hit on by a man at a bar who won't take no for an answer. Pupils are then asked to use the consequence tree template to consider 3 different ways in which Val could respond to the situation. For example, Val might call out to their friends for help, punch the man in the face, or just comply with the man's requests. Pupils should then think about the potential consequences of each action and draw smaller branches on the tree to demonstrate them. For example, if Val was to call out to their friends, the man might just move out of the way because he doesn't want to make a big scene or to get into trouble. Alternatively, maybe the friends then come over and the man might then back off again or possibly starts an argument which leads to some sort of fight. Having called their friends over might also lead to the person at the bar intervening, which might mean that the man is then kicked out, and either Val can enjoy the rest of the evening in some peace and quiet, or alternatively, the man might then wait outside the pub for Val out of some sort of perception of unfair treatment. The idea here is to build up lots of consequences of each of the potential actions, so you end up creating a tree of possibilities. The important part of this is to make sure that the outcomes are something which could potentially happen, but they don't necessarily have to all be positive outcomes, as demonstrated in the example. This is meant to look at all the things that could happen. Ultimately, this then becomes the basis of a discussion which evaluates each of the 3 actions. Which one has the most positive overall outcomes based on the ones they've identified? So what should Val do in this situation in order to get the best possible outcome? You could then flip it slightly and ask the pupils what would Val be most likely to do in this situation. It's all well and good knowing what we can do and what the potential outcomes are, but what do they think Val actually would do and why? And if that's not the same as what the best thing to do is, why is there this particular reason that Val is actively choosing not to do the thing in their best interest? The point of the activity is to help pupils to be more aware of the potential consequences of their actions through a distanced scenario. In other units where the task is used, it's also a way of encouraging pupils to come to a decision themselves rather than being told by a teacher about what they should and they shouldn't do. It might also be worth having a conversation with pupils about the fact that the story doesn't dictate whether Val is male or female, and therefore pupils may have made assumptions about whether Val was male or female. This may have shaped what they've written down on their consequence tree or their contributions in the conversation, and therefore if you highlight it towards the end of the discussion, you may be able to help pupils to reflect on their contributions and think about what they might have said differently had they thought about it from a different perspective. The last section of the lesson is about being an upstander. The video on slide 19 is a stimulus to trigger discussion on why bystanders may not intervene when they see sexual harassment occurring, and then also discussing potential ways of intervening. This then leads into discussion about the 5 Ds of bystander intervention, which are direct, distract, document, delegate, and delay. Pupils could then revisit the scenario involving Val and consider specific ways in which other people at the bar could have acted. At the very end of the lesson, pupils are asked to reflect on the compliments that they wrote down at the start of the lesson and to consider whether any of them may be viewed as an example of sexual harassment. Lesson 2 is focused on forms of commitment. Pupils are asked to identify significant milestones in romantic relationships, and they're asked to discuss what they know or how they might describe the terms marriage, civil partnership, and cohabitation. The first half of this lesson is designed to compare and contrast these forms of commitment, particularly the legal rights which are associated with each of them. To do this, pupils have an activity to complete on their worksheet in which they need to decide where various statements should be placed within this Venn diagram. As the statements are already on the worksheet, pupils need to only use the letter as a label rather than the whole sentence. For example, statement A describes where both individuals are responsible for all debts on a joint account. This is true of all types of relationships, regardless of whether they're romantic or not, because a joint account is accessible by anyone who is named on that account. And therefore, the letter A would go into the centre overlap area. Statement B describes a form of commitment which is only available to those aged 18 or over. This applies to marriage and civil partnerships, so this is placed in the overlap of those two circles, but not within the cohabitating circle. So one final example. C relates to this occurring between opposite sex couples, which again goes in the centre overlap as it's applicable to all three. You can use the teacher notes to help to clarify misunderstandings with pupils and then to check the correct answers as needed. The following slides include data which explores marriage rates over time. So when looking at this chart, you might want to ask pupils to consider why civil partnerships and marriage only start to appear on the graph in 2006 and 2015 respectively. Pupils who are paying attention to the title will realise that this reflects the relationship status of same-sex couples, and therefore they might be able to infer that these relationships were not given legal recognition until those 2 points in time, and that's why they only emerge on this graph at that point. You could also discuss why the numbers have increased so much. So is this because of population growth, or is this instead something to do with a reflection of the change in the social acceptance of same-sex couples? Pupils are then given scenarios and asked to identify which examples they think reflect legal marriages. The answers are provided in the file along with explanations for each of the 6 scenarios. Within these scenarios are an example of arranged marriage and forced marriage, which then leads into the final section of the lesson. Pupils are asked to explain how arranged and forced marriages are different, and then pupils can find out more about forced marriage through a video from Carmen Ivana and this information from the forced marriage unit. Pupils are also asked to consider how Layla, from one of the scenarios, might be able to access support in her situation. At the end of this lesson, there's an opportunity for pupils to anonymously ask questions or to make a comment about an aspect related to the forms of commitment, sexual harassment, or other RSE content. It's important that each pupil in the class writes something down to ensure that any questions which are written are truly anonymous. If pupils don't want to ask a question, they could instead write down their favourite flavour of ice cream or tell you a joke. Writing anonymous questions can help to take away a pupil's potential anxiety about asking a question to your face, but that's not to say that they don't want a personal response. So it can be really helpful to ask them to indicate whether they want a response to the whole class, which would maintain the confidentiality about who wrote it, whether they want a one-to-one response, which would require the pupil to include their name, or whether it's just a comment for your information. After the lesson, have a read through each of the responses and filter through the key questions and statements from other submissions. Then plan your responses, making sure that they're age and stage appropriate, and including sufficient time in the following lesson to share those answers as needed. The third lesson focuses on individuals' thoughts and feelings about having sex, and it starts with a do now task which asks pupils to consider the reasons why a person may wish to engage in a sexual act. It's important to allow any realistic responses here, but you may want to remind pupils to be respectful and appropriate in their descriptions and explanations when they're suggesting answers. Pupils are asked to consider the sexual acts or reasons for engaging in sexual acts which may be viewed as being socially acceptable and socially unacceptable today. To reduce potential awkwardness or responses to suggestions from others, pupils could instead write these on post-it notes, one for each, and then stick them to different areas of a wall or whiteboard as directed, and then you can read and summarise those notes. Pupils then asked to consider how the responses they've come up with as a class may have been different 40 years ago, and what might have been in a different position within these two circles. That conversation then leads directly into a discussion of Gail Rubin's charmed circle, which is shown here. The inner circle represents the behaviours or descriptions which Gail Rubin claimed was socially acceptable within 1984. The outer circle are then the behaviours which were deemed unacceptable at the time. It's worth spending some time here to discuss these examples to make sure that pupils understand what each word means, both in a literal sense, the word that is written there, but also the figurative sense of what it is representing thematically, but also the reasons why the beliefs may have been prevalent at the time. So, for example, near the top is a reference to sex within marriage being fine, but sex in sin as being unacceptable or problematic. The implication is that this refers to sex outside of marriage, either before marriage or potentially an affair with a person to whom this individual is not married. You could discuss the loaded meaning of the term in sin, as opposed to just saying that it's out of wedlock or beyond wedlock, and the inherent negative connotations that that language might bring. A term such as procreative may need breaking down to clarify that it's about the intent to conceive, rather than in the outer circle, which seemingly implies that someone is engaging in sexual acts purely for pleasure or enjoyment. Ensure to keep the discussions about any of these elements appropriate to pupils' age and stage. You may well feel that this content is too detailed for your cohort, so if you wanted to, you could adapt it and show a simplified version instead, which has the two circles still, but just a couple of selections of different words rather than the graphic from Rubin herself. After reading a handout about readiness for engaging in sexual acts, pupils are asked to think about how someone may feel and think when they're about to engage in a sexual act, particularly when doing so for a first time. Remember to remind pupils about distancing here. It's not a personal reflection, it is a hypothetical about how other people may feel. And this slide is then included in the slide deck so you can collate different ideas as a class. The last part of the lesson builds on this idea of readiness for engaging in sexual acts by asking pupils to use the Diamond 9 template to rank various factors. There's also one space left blank which pupils can fill themselves, the idea being that they may think of a relevant factor which isn't actually listed already. So in the example here, this pupil has suggested that they think the most important factor is age, and the least important factor is that the individual's friends have had sex. Now, the initial ranking within the Diamond 9 itself isn't so much the focus here, because it's actually really easy for students to write a couple of words in each box. They don't have to think about it much, let alone actually thinking hard about their ranking and the reasons why. So instead, to really push them a little bit and prompt them, you can ask pupils to add justifications for their top and bottom selections. That's then encouraging pupils to think harder about the reasons behind their decisions, but then it's also nudging them into thinking about what they might be able to contribute to a subsequent conversation when the class discusses it. As you can see from the example, they don't have to be particularly long, it's just to give a flavour of what the meaning behind the decision is. As discussed in training videos for other units, it can be useful to seek feedback from pupils about their Diamond 9 contributions so that they can get a sense of how others have responded. Normally, I'd recommend that you read each of the 9 responses and then ask pupils to raise their hands if it was ranked in their top 3, but pupils may feel more comfortable by distancing this given the nature of the content. So again, you could get them to write down their top and their bottom responses on a post-it note, anonymously stick it to a wall, and then you can use that to tally those results. It may well be that pupils feel happy and confident to do the same as they have in other lessons where they've raised their hands. I think it's certainly worth posing the questions to pupils to ensure that they're comfortable with what they're being asked to do. In any case, you ultimately want to end up with a tally of the numbers in the highest three on the diamond 9, and then a tally for the lowest placements as well in a second colour. And this can then open up conversations about the reasons for the placements. And you can focus on examples where there's a clear difference in responses. So, for example, in this case, the pupils in this class have said that they think that wanting a child isn't really a huge driving force in terms of whether someone is ready or not ready for sex. With the free space that's in the bottom right corner, the score isn't really going to be relevant in the same way, as it's just representing kind of a catch-all for all other options rather than one specific answer. However, it may be interesting to see how much or how little support there is for alternative answers which weren't already listed on the handout. Lesson 4 is focused on the various risks which may be associated with engaging in sexual acts, and it aims to show that it's not just about the risk of pregnancy or about getting an STI. Having said that, the Do Now activity does ask pupils to rank the 5 STIs listed in terms of which ones pupils think are the most commonly transmitted. It's important to clarify to pupils when you're revealing these answers that these statistics are calculated on the basis of how many transmissions there are across every 100,000 people. So this isn't a raw number, it's a figure pro rata, which is done to allow comparisons to be made over time, regardless of changes in the size of the population. As you can see by the data here, the chances of getting chlamydia are far higher than the chances of getting genital warts. And while transmissions did decrease during the COVID-19 pandemic, numbers for all 5 of these STIs are now rising. You can see there that there's then an added tally at the end to encompass statistics for all STIs. Prior to the lesson, you'll need to replace this image by generating a report for your local area using the Fingertips Public Health Data site, which is linked in the slide notes. You'll need to generate a sexual and reproductive health profile and then scroll down until you find figure 3, where you'll find your related graph or image. This diagram then has a shaded heat map which shows the nearby areas in your locality where new STI diagnoses are higher and lower. There's also an activity asking pupils to consider which of these sexual acts they think has the greatest risks of STI transmission and pregnancy. There's a few things to highlight when explaining this task. So firstly, even though we don't want to solely have a heteronormative focus where everything is about male and female relationships, the risk of pregnancy is only going to really relate to a couple involving a biological male and a biological female. Secondly, pupils might not be fully aware of the more formal terms used for specific acts. They might instead know the different euphemisms which might be used to allude to them. So it's worth checking in and making sure that they have an understanding of actually what we're talking about here. Being frank about what these acts are and not appearing overly nervous or trying to shut down conversations is actually more likely to lead to pupils just doing what you're asking them to do and not trying to react or goad you. It's also worth being aware that pupils might then want to ask more questions after these are highlighted and discussed. And also, this conversation could be uncomfortable for some pupils, so make sure that you link back to your ground rules and allow pupils to sit and watch the conversations if they're feeling uncomfortable or if they are requesting a right to pass. Pupils are then given a risk. They're working in groups to think beyond just pregnancy and STIs. So they have a poster with a broad category on it, and they need to think about the specific risks which might be associated with that category. For example, if pupils had the poster which said emotional responses, potential risks might involve regret or shame after the act, or it might be that they've got increased feelings of affection towards the other partner. There are examples in the scheme of learning for each of the poster topics to help to give you an idea of the sorts of examples which pupils may identify. When someone is thinking about whether or not they are ready to have sex, as was discussed in the previous lesson, the potential risks may be a factor, and it's important to be able to explore these in more detail. So pupils then have a task where we can take some of these examples, which were possibly identified in that previous activity, and they then compare the extent to which pupils think that they'll have an influence on whether or not someone has sex. In the example here, the pupil has suggested that the risk of getting an STI might be quite influential because people think that they'll automatically get an STI if they don't use a condom. In part, this could be because as teachers, we may overemphasize the potential risks of unprotected sex. But if you go back to the data from the beginning of this lesson, the incidence of chlamydia is about 1 in 100, and that's the most commonly transmitted STI. This task isn't necessarily about taking an objective view about statistics and rational thinking. It's an insight into the subjective views about perceptions of risk, which may well differ between one person and another, or one community and another as well. And adding those justifications, again, is really, really helpful to stimulating the conversation as a class. When you've discussed those views and you've annotated that template slide, you can give pupils time to reflect on which of the risks on the worksheet could be mitigated and the ways in which the extent of those risks could be reduced. One obvious answer was highlighted in the sample that was on the previous slide, in that the transmission of most STIs can be avoided by the use of condoms. This then nicely links into the focus of Lesson 5, which explores the forms of contraception beyond condoms. Pupils would have had a lesson in Year 9 which focused on external or male condoms, and this lesson is designed to consider other alternatives which are available. This Do Now activity acts as a callback to that lesson, asking pupils to recall the steps involved in using an external condom. This image shows both the external or the male condom along with an internal or a female condom, which is sometimes also known as a femidom. Pupils will probably recognise the external condom, but they may well have never seen or heard of an internal condom before. So there's information on the subsequent slides and in the scheme of learning to try to help pupils to recognise the differences between these two items. If you have one of the contraceptive kits from FPA, there should be one or more internal condoms in there which you might want to use to show pupils what they look like. The lesson then introduces alternative forms of contraception, so hormonal methods and barrier methods, temporary and permanent methods as well. Pupils are then divided into pairs and they're given resources to create profiles of their assigned form of contraception, which will then be shared with the class. Again, if you've got the FPA contraceptive kit, pupils could use the booklets in the kit as part of their research. There's also information sheets from the Irish Family Planning Association included within the resources, or if you've got access to the internet, pupils could use the Brook website or another reliable source to gather their information. Pupils then write their findings on their worksheet, as shown here in this example, and they then give that overview to the rest of the class. So pair by pair, they share what they've found. If you've got the contraceptive kit, you can show the examples and pass it around so pupils can see what it looks like. And then other pupils will be writing down the notes that are being suggested by that assigned pair. Ultimately, the whole class is working together to complete the worksheet. It's just that everyone has taken on responsibility for one row and they're sharing that knowledge. There's also an opportunity for pupils to demonstrate their understanding of the different forms of contraception by reading these scenarios and recommending an appropriate form of contraception for each situation. There are potential answers included for you to refer to, but it's difficult to say that any one form should be recommended without fully knowing a person's medical history and other factors at the time. There's certainly scope in some examples for other options to also be a possibility beyond what is listed on the teacher handout. So it's important to clarify with pupils, it's not just a simple binary of one being the right choice and the others being wrong choices. It's important that we can normalize the idea that people might need to try different methods before finding one which works for them, rather than implying that you've just got to pick one and you stick with it forever. There's also this diagram towards the end of the lesson to support conversations about emergency contraception, along with information about where the different types can be attained and in what circumstances. The important takeaway from this is that emergency contraception is more effective the sooner it is used after the unprotected sex or the condom breaks or whatever the situation may be, and that there's not just one type of emergency contraception. The Do Now activity for Lesson 6 actually tells pupils what the focus of the lesson is, although it does require them to find the 9-letter word in this puzzle. Ultimately, the task is designed to get pupils thinking. It's not just about that 9-letter word. Pupils could write their lists on a post-it note or inside their exercise books, depending on whether or not you want to keep the list afterwards. The rules are fairly simple. You can only use a letter as many times as it appears in the grid. So, for example, I couldn't use the word tell because there's only one L. Each word also needs to use the centre letter, so I couldn't use the word flirt either. I'd suggest giving pupils 2 or 3 minutes to create their lists, and then that you ask each pupil for one answer as you take the register to encourage everyone to contribute at the very beginning of the lesson. Pupils further down the register may have had all their words shared already by the time you reach them, so if you continue to ask pupils for answers in this way in future lessons, you might want to adjust the order in which you ask or find some other alternative just to try and make it as fair as possible. It also helps to keep the pupils on their toes. If you didn't spot it, the 9-letter word was fertility, and this knowledge worksheet here acts as a baseline task in that pupils are asked to write down their understanding of each of the 4 aspects of fertility listed, and then they can add information throughout the lesson in a pen of a different colour to show what they've taken in. The lesson explores some data related to fertility. This graph shows the total fertility rate for England and Wales, which basically means the average number of children that each woman is giving birth to across the country. That number is now the lowest on record, which could trigger conversations about why that may be the case. Do pupils think that it's because women are prioritising their careers and therefore waiting longer to have children and therefore having limited options to do so? Or is it financially motivated, with the cost of providing for children continuing to rise? In reality, it's probably going to be a complex combination of a range of factors, including all of these. For reference, the maroon dashed line, which sits just above 2, indicates the average fertility rate which would be needed to meet the maintenance level for the current size of the population. Having said that, our population size as a country continues to grow because we've also got increased immigration as opposed to emigration. So it's not just down to having more children in terms of the size of the population in the future. Another graph here, this time illustrating broadly how many eggs a woman has at different stages of her life, and therefore the optimal time frame for fertility. Unlike women and their eggs, men continue to produce sperm throughout their lives. Although those sperm may not be of the best quality, it is still possible for a man to father a child during his 80s or 90s. The lesson then looks at fertility treatments and considers the options available to heterosexual couples who have been unable to conceive naturally, as well as to same-sex couples who will require some form of external intervention in order to conceive. There's some really good videos in the lesson from the Fertility Education Initiative, which explore the different factors which can affect fertility, as well as the potential fertility treatments. Both of them mention a range of reasons why people may not be fertile or need to seek fertility treatments, including being part of a same-sex couple, having had cancer treatment, or having some form of other medical condition which may prevent someone from being able to carry a pregnancy to full term. This lesson also features a World of Work spotlight on the career of an embryologist, which explores exactly what they do in terms of running tests or fertilizing eggs as well. You can ask pupils if they find it interesting or if there's aspects that might be appealing for them to pursue as a potential career. This then leads into a conversation about access to IVF or in vitro fertilization within different areas. So before the lesson, you'll need to use the link in the slide notes to add information to the grid which reflects access to IVF in your area. It's very much a postcode lottery, with people in some areas being eligible for up to 3 paid IVF cycles under the NHS, while in other areas you may only be limited to 1 or possibly not even eligible at all if one of the partners already has children. In turn, that discussion then leads into this task in which pupils need to determine the family or individual who they think should be the greatest priority for selection for a funded IVF cycle. Pupils will need to consider the pros and cons associated with each situation and then come to their decision. You can then use this template in the slide deck to come to a whole class agreement about who deserves the funded treatment. It's important to encourage those explanations and justifications of viewpoints. It's also important to be aware of potential sensitivities which pupils may have, either because they have parents or other family members who are going through these sorts of fertility treatments, or possibly because they've got a similar experience to someone who's featured within one of those scenarios. Lesson 7 explores pregnancy options, and it starts with this do now task, which asks pupils to list the reasons that a person may think that they're pregnant. The missed period is probably going to be the go-to answer. It's worth clarifying that girls and women might skip periods for a range of reasons. When they're first menstruating, their cycles can be kind of erratic or inconsistent, or alternatively, if their body weight is too low or too great, then the body may recognize that and then stop menstruating as well. There's examples of potential indicators of pregnancy in the slide deck, as well as a video which explains how urine pregnancy tests operate. The bulk of this lesson follows the story of Ruby and Alex, who feature in a series of videos from Brooke. There are 2 short introductory videos, and then 3 subsequent videos which tell parallel stories about the couple deciding to keep the baby, adopt it out, or seek an abortion. It's important to highlight that, though it's not necessarily explicitly mentioned, this scenario is about a male-female heterosexual relationship. We have many gender-neutral names and examples of same-sex relationships within the OAT curriculum, but the nature of this conversation about unplanned pregnancy means that the example needs to be a heterosexual relationship. There will be an opportunity for calling back to conversations about abortions, particularly in the next lesson when looking at ectopic pregnancies, which can also occur during fertility treatments and are therefore of relevance to people both in same-sex relationships and people who aren't in a relationship at all, who might be undergoing fertility treatment. Back to this task, pupils are divided into groups and they're assigned one of the 3 pregnancy options, and they're asked to summarise key legal information as well as potential benefits and disadvantages of their assigned option. They're going to use the consequence tree template for the activity, although it's with a different emphasis this time. So the groups will need to feed back about their key findings and the pros and cons to allow other groups to be able to add to their own worksheets as well. Pupils will still need to come to their conclusions about which option they think is objectively best in this situation. In this activity, however, because pupils are getting information from an external source, the idea that they're writing down are more likely, but not always, to be objective, as opposed to wild suggestions of random things which might just happen, as may be the situation with other consequence tree tasks. The structure you would probably want to see is something like this, with the 3 options on the trunk, and then separate areas for the legal aspects, pros and cons, and possibly also any other relevant information that pupils want to add. Once pupils have a complete tree, you can then discuss what pupils think are the best options for Ruby and Alex at this time and why. You can then further tinker with that conversation by asking pupils to consider which factors are going to affect the decision that the 2 of them make, such as their education opportunities now and in the future, the views of family members or financial pressures, and then debating which of those factors is the greatest weight in terms of which one they're going to really pay attention to the most. Moving into lesson 8, we're now looking at what happens during pregnancy. So there's a do now activity which asks pupils to arrange these animals in order of the shortest gestation period, or the length of pregnancy, to the longest gestation period. And then when pupils have their lists, you could ask them to write in there where they think humans would fit in that lineup. Discuss pupils' ideas as a class, and then you can share the answers and see how they've gone. We then have an informal baseline check-in. Pupils will probably have heard stories about what might happen in pregnancy or things that might lead to pregnancy, although they may not be fully convinced about how accurate those ideas are. So this is an opportunity for pupils to share the things they're pretty certain are true, but also it's a safe space where they can share the things which they've heard without necessarily having to say whether they believe it or not, and then have those ideas proven or debunked throughout the lesson as might be appropriate. This animation here is included in the slide deck to help pupils to recognise that the internal female reproductive system isn't just a flat image which maybe looks like a jester's hat when it gets drawn sometimes. it is a three-dimensional organ. The uterus itself is, as shown here, actually at an angle compared to the vagina. It's roughly the size of a fist. And you can make a similar shape by bending your wrist like you're doing a mini bicep curl with really bad form, and then sticking your thumb and your little finger out to the sides to represent the fallopian tubes and the ovaries. There's then a recall activity where pupils are asked to identify key features of the internal female reproductive system and their functions, and if you click on each of the boxes, it will reveal the labels below. As part of this conversation on pregnancy, it's important to highlight how commonly miscarriages can occur. It is estimated that roughly 1 in 4 pregnancies end in miscarriage, and that often happens even before the mother even realizes that she's pregnant. And yet, regardless of how common it is, it's an issue which continues to be fairly taboo and not really discussed openly. Given the nature of miscarriage and the lack of the frank conversation about incidences, it's obviously really difficult to get an exact figure on how many miscarriages have happened. But the charities SANS and Tommy's have estimated it's somewhere in the region of 110 to 120,000 miscarriages within the past 4 years. It's also a really good opportunity to highlight ectopic pregnancies, which are where the embryo implants in a location other than the wall of the uterus. The vast majority of ectopic pregnancies occur in the fallopian tubes, but as you can see in the image on the right, it may also happen within the ovaries, within the cervix, or actually in the muscle of the uterus itself, rather than on the lining. Pupils then have a task to complete where they try to guess the stages of pregnancy at which key developmental events occur, and they plot them on the timeline. You can use the template on the slide deck to show where different pupils think their answers are, and pupils can then make correction using a pen of a different colour when their answers are revealed, as shown in the example here. You can then call back to content from the previous lesson about abortion and ask pupils to recall the legal limit to elective abortions and consider the development of the fetus at that point in time. This diagram shows not only the relative sizes of fetus throughout its development, but also the times of key developmental phases for various organs. You could ask pupils to consider at what point the mother might realise that she's pregnant. It's commonly around the 5 to 6 week stage, once the mother has missed their period, or if they're identifying other symptoms that we've discussed at the start of the previous lesson. Those first 6 weeks, however, is a really important time for the development of the heart, the central nervous system, and the eyes. And if the mother is ingesting alcohol or is smoking or around cigarette smoke in the time when she's unknowingly pregnant, then she could be doing harm to the unborn baby. If time allows, there's also an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper into the effect of external substances on the developing fetus, with pupils receiving information about the effects of alcohol, thalidomide, and smoking on fetal development. Pupils could add key pieces of information to their timeline worksheet from earlier in the lesson to highlight times or effects as mentioned in their assigned handout, and then they can share those findings with the wider class. And those discussions can then lead into these questions here, which unpack the idea of parental responsibility, specifically within the contexts of responsibilities of unborn children. And that then sets up the final lesson of the unit, which focuses on parenting. And that final lesson starts with a task where pupils are asked to identify the fictional parents and the films in which these fictional parents appear, as well as trying to identify 3 words to describe the parents in each image. Once pupils have completed the task, you could ask for one pupil to identify the parents, and then for other pupils to share one of their chosen words whilst you're completing the register. Part of the discussion in this lesson looks at the legal responsibilities of parents as outlined on the gov.uk website. You can extend this discussion by asking pupils if there are examples listed which they don't think should be legal responsibilities, and if there's other examples which are not listed, which pupils feel should be a legal requirement instead. Pupils then have a task where they need to plot 12 different parental responsibilities according to how important or unimportant pupils consider those actions to be, as well as the extent to which the child might appreciate that action being carried out. It might be easier to tell pupils to work on the assumption that the child is their age as there's probably going to be a difference in the views of asking a 15-year-old as opposed to asking a 5-year-old. In this example here, responsibility A relates to asking the child's opinion when the parent is making significant life decisions. You can see the annotation, which explains this pupil's thinking, suggesting that something significant at least warrants a question to find out what the child thinks, even if maybe they're not going to listen, at least trying to get a sense of what that child feels. By asking pupils to add their justifications, again, they're going to be ready to contribute to the subsequent whole class conversations about their placements and their reasons. As a side note, if pupils aren't going to have the handout which lists all of the responsibilities glued into their books or available in booklets opposite this worksheet, you may want to ask that they instead label their plots with a couple of keywords so that it's easy to identify what each of the plots relates to when they look at it or you look at it at a later point in time. We then have another timeline activity. This one is based on an activity from the PSHE Association. In pairs or in small groups, pupils are asked to consider the parental responsibilities specific to an assigned age group. For example, up to the age of 1, the parents might need to feed the baby, to soothe it and help it to go to sleep, and to clean it. Those responsibilities aren't necessarily all the same when it comes to a child who is 18 or older. This template is included in the slide deck, so you can compile all the suggestions from different groups and discuss the similarities and differences between the different stages of childhood. If you are a PSHE Association member, you can download a worksheet and sample answers from their website via the link in the side notes. The final part of this lesson explores different approaches to parenting, with pupils working in groups to consider the potential benefits and disadvantages of each of these 4 parenting styles. There's no one right way, and some people may have an approach which incorporates more than one of these examples. After this activity, these styles are then compared to helicopter parents, which is a relatively newer term in relation to parenting. Most of the lessons in this unit include additional resources which you can use to increase your subject knowledge or to refer to as needed. But if you're looking for further information to support your delivery of these lessons, then you may find these organisations helpful. Brooke is a sexual health and wellbeing charity for young people. Their website offers a range of resources such as on-demand training, some of which is free, as well as lesson plans, posters, and fact sheets. Contraception Choices is a really useful resource to enhance your subject knowledge about different forms of contraception. There are the standard information pages about each of the different types, as well as dedicated videos to dispel myths and answer commonly asked questions, as well as Q&A pages on specific issues such as the potential challenges of contraception, the effects of hormones on the body, and the impact of menopause on fertility. The PSHE Association is a subject association for PSHE. They provide guidance, training, and lesson resources to align with the statutory RSE requirements. Members of the PSHE Association can access additional resources from Medway Public Health, which have been featured in various RSE units across the OAT curriculum. And finally, SURE is an organisation dedicated to tackling online harms, including image-based abuse and digital consent. Their website is focused on helping students to navigate relationships in a digital world, as well as understanding their rights related to online safety and privacy, but it could be helpful to look at in order to better understand how to frame answers to anonymous questions or to get ideas about how to tackle certain conversations within lessons.